The moment my daughter-in-law Chloe handed me that handwritten invoice demanding $300 for monthly accommodation fees in my own kitchen, I knew something had shifted forever in the house where I'd raised my children and buried my husband. She stood there with her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the granite countertop I'd saved 2 years to afford, smiling that thin smile she reserved for when she thought she'd won something. My son Marcus just sat at the breakfast table scrolling through his phone like his mother wasn't being charged rent to live in her own home. That was the moment I realized I'd been too quiet for too long, and they were about to learn exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like every other Tuesday since Marcus and Chloe moved back into my house 6 months ago. I was up at 5:30 brewing coffee in the machine Gerald bought me for our 25th anniversary, the one with the timer that still worked perfectly even though he'd been gone 3 years now. The kitchen was my sanctuary in those early hours before the house woke up, before Chloe's voice cut through the air with demands and Marcus's silence filled the spaces where his father's laughter used to live. I'd been making scrambled eggs when I heard her heels clicking down the hardwood stairs, each step deliberate and sharp like she was announcing her arrival to subjects rather than family. Chloe appeared in the doorway wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair pulled back in that severe bun she favored when she meant business. She was 28 but carried herself like someone who'd been managing boardrooms for decades, which I suppose she had been since graduating business school and landing that position at her father's investment firm. "Good morning, Velma," she said, my name coming out flat and professional like I was the hired help. She never called me Mom, not even when she and Marcus got engaged. Always Velma, always with that slight pause before it like she was reminding herself to be polite. I turned from the stove and offered her a plate. "Morning, honey. Eggs?" She wrinkled her nose the way she always did when I offered her anything I'd cooked, like my food might contaminate her carefully curated lifestyle. "I don't eat eggs. Too much cholesterol." She opened the refrigerator and pulled out one of those expensive green smoothies that cost $8 each and tasted like grass clippings. "Besides, we need to talk about the living situation here." "Something in?" Her tone made my stomach tighten. I'd heard that voice before in the months since they'd moved in, usually right before she announced some new rule about the house or some change she wanted to make to rooms I'd decorated with Gerald's help over 30 years of marriage. Last month it was the living room furniture she deemed dated. The month before that, she'd convinced Marcus they needed to repaint the master bedroom because the blue walls I'd chosen reminded her of a nursing home. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands had started to shake slightly. I set the spatula down and turned to face her fully, something I'd learned to do when Gerald was alive. He always said you could tell when someone was about to deliver bad news by the way they avoided eye contact. Chloe took a long sip of her smoothie, making me wait. It was a power move, one I recognized from my years working as an administrative assistant at the law firm before Gerald's insurance money allowed me to retire early. "Well, Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it's time we formalized our arrangement here." "Formalized how?" The eggs were starting to burn behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away from her face. Something was coming, something bigger than paint colors or furniture arrangements. She reached into her leather handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, cream-colored stationery with her initials embossed at the top in gold. "We've drawn up a little agreement. Nothing too complicated, just outlining everyone's responsibilities. Now that we're all sharing the space." I took the paper with fingers that felt suddenly clumsy and unfolded it slowly. At the top, written in Chloe's precise handwriting, were the words, "Household Financial Contribution Agreement." Below that, a list of items that made my vision blur around the edges. Monthly accommodation fee for Velma Stone, $300. Utility contribution, $50. Kitchen usage fee, $25. The list went on, itemizing every aspect of living in what had been my home for over 3 decades. "Kitchen usage fee?" I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "This is my house, Chloe." She straightened, and I caught a flicker of something cold behind her perfectly applied makeup. "Actually, Velma, if you look at the deed, you'll see that Marcus is listed as co-owner. His father put the house in both their names when Marcus turned 21. Very forward-thinking of Gerald, really. And since Marcus and I are married, that makes me a co-owner as well." The kitchen tilted slightly, like I was standing on the deck of a boat in rough water. "That's not Gerald would have told me. If he'd done something like that." Chloe's smile widened, showing teeth so white they looked artificial. "Oh, but he did. We found the paperwork when we were going through Marcus's father's filing cabinet last month. Right there in black and white." Marcus owns half this house, which means we have every right to establish some ground rules for how it's managed. I looked past her to where Marcus was sitting at the breakfast table, still staring at his phone like this conversation wasn't happening 10 feet away from him. Marcus? I called to him, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Is this true? He finally looked up, but only briefly before his eyes slid away from mine. Mom, we just think it would be better if everything was more official. You know, clear expectations and all that. Clear expectations? I repeated, feeling heat rise in my chest like steam from a kettle. You want me to pay rent to live in the house where I changed your diapers and nursed you through pneumonia when you were 7? Chloe stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and sharp that always made my nose itch. Velma, this isn't personal. It's just practical. We're all adults here, and adults pay their fair share. You'll still have your room, of course, and access to common areas during designated hours. Designated hours? The words came out as barely a whisper. Well, Marcus and I are young professionals. We need space to entertain clients, host dinner parties. You understand. She glanced around the kitchen with the air of someone surveying property they'd just purchased. We're thinking the living room and dining room would be off limits to you on weekends, and perhaps we could establish some quiet hours in the evenings. Nothing unreasonable. I set the paper down on the counter with hands that were definitely shaking now. The eggs behind me were definitely burning, filling the air with the acrid smell of ruined food, but I couldn't seem to make myself care. This woman was standing in my kitchen, wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly social security check, telling me I needed permission to use my own living room. And if I don't sign this? I asked. Chloe exchanged a look with Marcus, one of those married couple communications that happened without words. Well, that would be unfortunate. Marcus really doesn't want to have to choose between his wife and his mother, but if you're going to be difficult about reasonable boundaries. She let the threat hang in the air like smoke. I looked at my son again, this man I'd carried for 9 months and loved for 32 years, waiting for him to say something, anything, that sounded like the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead, he just shrugged and went back to his phone. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Chloe said, her voice bright with false understanding. Take all the time you need. We'll just need the first month's payment by Friday so we can get everything set up properly. She tucked the paper under the sugar bowl like she was leaving a tip at a restaurant and clicked back out of the kitchen, calling over her shoulder that she'd be working late and not to wait dinner for her. Marcus followed without a word, leaving me alone with the smell of burnt eggs and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I stood there for a long time after they left, staring at that piece of paper like it might change if I looked at it hard enough. $300 for the privilege of sleeping in the bedroom where Gerald and I had shared 30 years of whispered conversations and Sunday morning coffee. $25 to use the kitchen where I'd taught Marcus to make pancakes when he was 8 years old. $50 for utilities in the house where I'd been paying electric bills since before Chloe was born. The house felt different around me suddenly, like the walls had shifted when I wasn't looking. The family photos on the refrigerator seemed to mock me, all those pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and graduation days when Marcus still looked at me like I hung the moon. Now I was apparently a tenant in my own life, a boarder in the place where I'd built every memory that mattered. I turned off the burner and scraped the ruined eggs into the garbage disposal, watching the yellow mess disappear down the drain. Like my sense of security. The paper sat on the counter where Chloe had left it, her elegant handwriting spelling out my new reality in terms that couldn't be misunderstood. I was no longer the mother, the homeowner, the woman who'd sacrificed to keep this place running when Gerald's medical bills threatened to drown us. I was now, apparently, a problem to be managed. But as I stood there in the kitchen that still smelled like burnt breakfast and broken trust, something Gerald used to say came back to me with startling clarity. He'd been a patient man, slow to anger but fierce when pushed too far, and whenever someone underestimated him at work or tried to take advantage of his quiet nature, he'd smile that particular smile and say, "Honey, some people mistake kindness for weakness. Those people always learn the difference eventually." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the drawer where I kept important documents, right next to the actual deed to the house that Gerald and I had paid off 5 years before he died. The deed with my name on it, alone, just like it had been since the day we signed the mortgage in 1994. Because whatever Chloe thought she'd found in Marcus's father's filing cabinet, whatever story she was telling herself about co-ownership and ground rules, she was about to learn something very important about the difference between confidence and facts. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table where my husband had read the newspaper every morning for 3 decades, where my son had done homework and eaten countless bowls of cereal, where I'd signed birthday cards and paid bills and planned family vacations to beaches that seemed impossibly far away back then. The morning light streamed through the window above the sink, hitting the small crystal Gerald had hung there on our first Christmas in the house. It cast tiny rainbows across the wall, the same rainbows that had fascinated Marcus when he was little enough to believe in magic. I was still looking at those rainbows when I heard Chloe's car pull out of the driveway, her BMW purring like a satisfied cat as she headed off to whatever important business required her to wear suits that cost more than most people's rent. Marcus had left 20 minutes earlier in his truck, probably headed to the construction site where he'd been working since the economy forced him to abandon his dreams of opening his own architectural firm. Neither of them had said goodbye. The silence that followed felt different than the comfortable quiet I'd grown used to in the years since Gerald's death. This was charged somehow, electric with possibility and danger in equal measure. I had until Friday to decide whether I was going to pay $300 to live in my own house or find out what happened when I refused to play along with Chloe's version of reality. I thought about calling my sister Ruth, who'd been telling me for months that Chloe was trouble with a capital T and Marcus was too blind to see it. Ruth had never been one to hold back her opinions, especially about family matters, and she'd made it clear that she thought I was being a doormat to my own son and his wife. But pride kept me from reaching for the phone. This was my family, my house, my problem to solve. Instead, I did what I always did when I needed to think clearly. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Gerald and opened the closet where I kept his things, clothes I couldn't bring myself to donate and papers I'd never quite finished sorting through. In the back, behind a box of his old ties and the suit he'd worn to Marcus's high school graduation, was a metal filing box I'd forgotten about until this moment. Gerald had been meticulous about paperwork, the kind of man who kept receipts for everything and filed documents in labeled folders with the precision of a librarian. After he died, I'd been too overwhelmed with grief and medical bills to go through everything properly. I'd boxed up what looked important and dealt with the immediate necessities, but there were whole sections of his record-keeping that I'd never explored. I pulled the box out and set it on the bed, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside were folders organized by year, going back to when we'd first bought the house. Mortgage papers, insurance documents, tax returns, home improvement receipts. But there, near the bottom, was a folder labeled Legal Documents in Gerald's careful handwriting. Inside that folder was our will, updated just 2 years before Gerald's death when his doctor first mentioned the word cancer. Below that were power of attorney forms, medical directives, and then, at the very bottom, a copy of something that made my breath catch in my throat. A quitclaim deed, dated 3 years ago, transferring Gerald's half of the house to me and me alone, signed and notarized and filed with the county clerk's office a full month before he died. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the paper shaking in my hands as I read it again to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Gerald had made sure that when he died, I would be the sole owner of our home. Not Marcus, not anyone else. Just me. Which meant that whatever Chloe thought she'd found in that filing cabinet, whatever story she was telling about co-ownership and legal rights, was based on information that was either outdated or flat out wrong. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest, not because anything was funny but because the relief was so overwhelming it had to come out somehow. Gerald had protected me even from the grave, had made sure that no matter what happened after he was gone, I would never be homeless in my own life. He'd known, somehow, that this day might come, that Marcus might need to be reminded who owned what and who owed him respect. I held the deed against my chest and let myself feel the full weight of what Chloe had tried to do. She'd attempted to turn me into a tenant in my own home, to charge me rent for sleeping in the bed where my husband had died, to make me pay for the privilege of cooking meals in the kitchen where I'd fed my family for 30 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd counted on my ignorance, my grief, my reluctance to fight with the son I'd raised to be better than this. But grief, I was learning, could also be a teacher. It had taught me that loss was inevitable but dignity was a choice. It had shown me that being alone didn't mean being powerless, that quiet didn't mean weak. And now it was about to teach Chloe and Marcus something they clearly needed to learn about the difference between taking advantage of someone and taking them for granted. I put the deed back in its folder but kept the folder out on the dresser, where I could see it. Then I went back downstairs and made myself a proper breakfast, eggs that didn't burn and toast that actually tasted like food. I ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was a small act of rebellion, which in a way it was. I was eating in my own kitchen at my own table without anyone's permission, and that felt like victory enough for now. When I was finished, I washed my dishes and put them away in cupboards that Gerald and I had installed ourselves the summer Marcus turned 16. I wiped down counters that we'd chosen together from a catalog that promised they'd last a lifetime. I straightened dish towels and arranged fruit in the bowl that had been a wedding gift from my mother, gone now for 15 years but still present in the small rituals that made a house a home. Then I sat down with a pen and a piece of my own stationery, the kind with my name embossed at the top in simple black letters, and began to write. Not a response to Chloe's demands, but a list of my own. Things that needed to be clarified, boundaries that needed to be established, and consequences that needed to be understood by everyone involved. At the top of the page, I wrote in my clearest handwriting, house rules for all residents. Below that, I began to outline what life in Velma Stone's house was actually going to look like from now on. Because if Chloe wanted to play games about ownership and authority, I was more than ready to remind her who actually held the deed to this particular playing field. The morning light was still casting rainbows on the kitchen wall when I finished writing, but now they looked less like childhood magic and more like a promise. By Friday, when Chloe expected her first rent payment, she was going to get something very different instead. She was going to get the truth, delivered with all the kindness and consideration she'd shown me. Which was to say, none at all. I folded my list carefully and put it in the same drawer where I'd placed her demands, right next to the deed that proved who really owned this house and everything in it. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled in to wait for my son and his wife to come home, because we were all going to have a conversation that was long overdue. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday, but inside the house where I'd raised my children and buried my husband, revolution was brewing in the kitchen that belonged to me and me alone. Chloe had made the mistake of thinking that a grieving widow would be easy to intimidate, that age and loss had made me vulnerable to manipulation and financial abuse. She was about to learn how very wrong she was. The next 3 days passed like a chess game where only I knew all the pieces on the board. Chloe moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won, making casual comments about our new arrangement and asking me sweetly if I'd had time to review the paperwork. Marcus avoided eye contact entirely, hurrying past me in hallways like a guilty child who knew he'd done something wrong but hoped if he moved fast enough, no one would notice. I spent those days doing what Gerald had taught me to do whenever faced with a problem that seemed bigger than I could handle: research, prepare, and gather allies. The first call I made was to Jefferson County Clerk's office, where a bored-sounding woman named Patricia confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear from an official source. The house at 847 Maple Grove Drive was owned solely by Velma Marie Stone, with no other names on the current deed. The quitclaim transfer from Gerald had been properly filed and recorded 3 years ago, making me the undisputed legal owner of every square inch of the property. Is there any possibility of a co-ownership claim from a family member? I asked, keeping my voice casual like I was asking about property taxes. Patricia's laugh was dry and professional. Ma'am, unless someone else's name is on this deed or they've got a court order saying otherwise, you're the only person with any legal claim to that property. Family relationships don't change property law. The second call was to my neighbor Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old retired paralegal who'd lived across the street for 40 years and had a memory like a steel trap when it came to neighborhood gossip. She'd been Gerald's poker buddy's wife and had always been fond of me, especially after I'd helped her when her husband died 2 years ago. Velma, honey, she said when I explained my situation, that girl's been strutting around here like she owns the place since the day she moved in. Last week she had the audacity to tell me my roses were hanging over the property line. I told her I'd cut them when she showed me the survey that proved it. Mrs. Chen had spent 30 years helping lawyers navigate property disputes, and she offered to look over any documents I wanted to show her. More importantly, she had something Chloe didn't know existed: a security camera system that captured most of our driveways and front yards. Been recording everything since those break-ins on Elm Street last year, she said with satisfaction. You'd be amazed what people say and do when they think nobody's watching. The third call was the hardest one to make. I dialed my brother-in-law, Tom, Gerald's younger brother who'd become an estate attorney after serving in the Navy. Tom had handled Gerald's will and the deed transfer, but we'd barely spoken since the funeral. Not because of any bad blood, but because talking to him meant confronting how much I missed Gerald, and some days that grief still felt too heavy to carry in conversation. Velma, Tom's voice was warm but surprised when I explained why I was calling. That little weasel. Gerald specifically set things up so this couldn't happen. He was worried about Marcus's judgment when it came to money and wanted to make sure you'd never be vulnerable. You mean he saw this coming? Tom was quiet for a moment. He saw Marcus struggling with direction, and he definitely had concerns about Chloe's influence. Gerald loved that boy, but he wasn't blind to his weaknesses. He wanted to protect you from having to choose between your security and your relationship with your son. Well, it looks like that choice is being forced. Anyway, Not if I have anything to say about it, Tom said, his voice taking on the edge it used to get when he talked about military strategy. What exactly did this woman threaten you with? I read him Chloe's list word for word, and with each item, Tom's breathing got heavier. By the time I finished, he was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Tom? You still there? I'm here, he said, and his voice was deadly calm. Velma, what she's doing isn't just morally reprehensible. It's potentially criminal. Demanding payment for housing when she has no legal right to the property, threatening eviction when she has no authority to do so, that could constitute extortion depending on how aggressive she gets about it. I don't want to press charges against my son. Marcus isn't the one running this con, and we both know it. But he's going to have to choose which side he's on, because what his wife is doing could land them both in serious legal trouble if she pushes it. Tom offered to drive down from Indianapolis that weekend to help me handle the situation, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself, in my own way, in my own house. What I asked for instead was advice about the legal boundaries of what I could and couldn't do as the sole property owner. Legally, you can evict them with proper notice, Tom explained. 30 days in Indiana if they're month-to-month tenants, which they probably are since there's no lease. You can also establish house rules as the property owner, including restrictions on guests, noise, common area usage, whatever you want within reason. What about charging them rent? Tom laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him since Gerald's funeral. Velma, you can charge them whatever you want for the privilege of living in your house. Market rate, below market rate, or enough to make them think twice about their life choices. It's your property. And if they refuse to pay? Then you evict them. Family or not, they're adults living in property they don't own. The law doesn't care if they're related to you. After I hung up with Tom, I sat at Gerald's old desk in the corner of the living room and began to draft what I privately thought of as my own household agreement. But unlike Chloe's demand for payment, mine was going to be based on actual legal authority and 30 years of knowing exactly what this house was worth. I started with research, looking up rental prices for similar homes in our neighborhood. 4-bedroom houses with attached garages and finished basements were renting for between $1,800 and $2,200 a month, depending on condition and amenities. My house was in excellent condition, recently updated, and in one of the most desirable school districts in the county. If anything, it was worth more than the average. Then I calculated utilities, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. For the past year, between the mortgage being paid off and Gerald's life insurance money, I'd been comfortable enough to keep up with everything, but Chloe and Marcus's presence had nearly doubled the electric bill and significantly increased water usage. The grocery bills had tripled, partly because Chloe insisted on buying expensive organic everything and partly because Marcus had reverted to eating like the teenage football player he'd been 20 years ago. When I finished my calculations, I had a number that made my eyebrows raise even though I'd done the math myself. Fair market rent for a house like mine, split between 2 working adults, would be about $1,100 each per month. Add utilities, food, and the premium for living in a house that came with a built-in housekeeper, cook, and caretaker in the form of dear old mom, and they were looking at a total monthly benefit of close to $3,000. I thought about Gerald as I worked, remembering how he used to pay bills at the same desk every month, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose while he carefully entered numbers in the ledger book he kept for household expenses. He'd been methodical about money, never flashy but always fair, and he'd taught me that the most important thing about any financial transaction was that everyone involved understood exactly what they were getting and what they owed. Chloe, apparently, had never learned that lesson. By Thursday evening, I had everything prepared. My own household agreement, printed on the same cream-colored stationery Chloe had used but with significantly different terms. Copies of the deed, the quitclaim transfer, and Tom's business card. A rental market analysis showing comparable properties in the area. And a timeline that gave Marcus and Chloe exactly what they'd given me, until Friday to make a decision about their future living arrangements. Marcus came home from work that evening covered in sawdust and concrete dust, looking tired in the way that came from 10 hours of physical labor in the Indiana heat. He kicked off his work boots by the back door and headed straight for the refrigerator, pulling out a beer and drinking half of it before he noticed me sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice carefully casual. "What are you working on?" "Just some paperwork," I replied, not looking up from the document I was reviewing. "Where's Chloe?" "Working late again. Big presentation tomorrow or something." He finished his beer and reached for another one, a habit that had started shortly after they moved in and seemed to be getting worse each week. "She said to remind you about Friday." "Oh, I haven't forgotten about Friday," I said, finally looking up at him. In fact, I have something for both of you. Could you ask her to be here tomorrow evening around 6? I'd like to discuss the household situation with both of you together. Something in my tone must have alerted him that this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected, because he set down his beer and really looked at me for the first time in weeks. Mom, are you okay? You seem different. Different. That was one word for it. I'd spent the past 3 days remembering who I was before grief and loneliness made me forget, remembering the woman Gerald had fallen in love with and the mother who'd raised a son to be better than this. I'd spent 72 hours rediscovering my own strength, and apparently it showed. I'm fine, Marcus. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Just need to clear up some confusion about the house and how things are going to work going forward. He shifted uncomfortably, picking at the label on his beer bottle. Chloe wasn't trying to be mean, you know. She just thinks structure is important. Organization. I'm sure she does, I said evenly. And tomorrow we'll talk about what kind of structure is appropriate for this particular household. Mom, I hope you're not going to make this weird. We're family. That stopped me cold. I set down my pen and looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to find traces of the boy who used to help me fold laundry and tell me about his dreams of building beautiful buildings that would last forever. Marcus, when's the last time you asked me how I was doing? When's the last time you thanked me for cooking dinner or washing your clothes or any of the 100 things I do to make this house run smoothly? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Again. When's the last time you told your wife that disrespecting me in my own home wasn't acceptable? When's the last time you acted like my son instead of her enabler? His face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. That's not fair, Mom. It's complicated. No, Marcus, it's really not. Either you respect me or you don't. Either this is my house or it isn't. Either you're my son who was raised to treat people with dignity, or you're a stranger who thinks he can charge me rent to live in my own home. He set his beer down hard enough that foam spilled onto the counter. Fine. I'll tell Chloe to be here tomorrow. But I hope you're ready to be reasonable about this. Reasonable. There was that word again, the one Chloe had used when she handed me her list of demands. I watched Marcus storm out of the kitchen and heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, the same stairs he used to slide down on Christmas morning when he was small enough to believe in magic and old enough to know that home was the safest place in the world. That night, I went through Gerald's closet one more time, not looking for documents but for strength. I pulled out his favorite shirt, the soft blue flannel he wore for yard work and lazy Sunday mornings, and held it against my face. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and the sawdust that seemed to permanently cling to everything he owned after 40 years in construction. I know you tried to protect me, I whispered into the empty bedroom. I know you saw this coming and did everything you could to make sure I'd be okay. But I think you also knew I'd have to fight for myself eventually. I think you knew I was stronger than I remembered. I folded the shirt carefully and put it back, but I kept one of his ties, a navy blue one with small silver patterns that he'd worn to every important occasion in our marriage. Tomorrow, when I faced down my son and his wife, I wanted something of Gerald's with me, a reminder that love sometimes meant setting boundaries and that protection sometimes looked like holding people accountable for their choices. Friday morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of August day that made the air shimmer above the pavement and sent smart people indoors before noon. I was up early as always, but this time I took extra care with my appearance. I showered and styled my hair, put on the navy dress Gerald had always said brought out my eyes, and clipped on the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I wasn't dressing up for Chloe or Marcus, I was dressing up for myself, for the woman I'd forgotten I could be when I stopped letting other people define my worth. Chloe left for work before I came downstairs, but not before leaving another note on the kitchen counter reminding me about our agreement and suggesting I could leave the check on the table if I wouldn't be home when she returned. The casual entitlement of it made my jaw clench, but I folded the note calmly and added it to the growing collection of evidence that demonstrated exactly what kind of person my daughter-in-law really was. I spent the day cleaning house, not because it needed it but because I wanted everything to be perfect when we had our conversation. I vacuumed carpets that Gerald and I had picked out together, dusted furniture we'd collected over 3 decades of marriage, and polished the hardwood floors he'd refinished himself the summer before his diagnosis. Every surface I cleaned felt like reclaiming territory, every room I straightened felt like preparing for battle. At 4 o'clock, I set 3 places at the dining room table using the good china that had been my grandmother's, the plates I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come. If we were going to discuss the future of this household, we were going to do it with dignity and proper dishes, not paper plates and plastic forks like some college dorm room negotiation. At 5:30, I arranged my documents in neat piles on the mahogany sideboard Gerald had built himself during his apprenticeship, each stack organized and labeled so there could be no confusion about facts versus feelings. The deed. The rental. Market analysis. Tom's business card. My own household agreement. And at the bottom, like an ace I was holding for the right moment, a copy of Chloe's original demands with my response written in red ink across the bottom. Marcus arrived home. At 5:45, earlier than usual and clearly nervous. He'd showered and changed clothes at work, trading his construction gear for khakis and a polo shirt that made him look younger and more uncertain than his 32 years. He hovered in the doorway of the dining room like he was afraid to commit to entering. "Mom, are you sure we need to do this? Can't we just talk it out in the kitchen like normal people?" I looked up from arranging the silverware and gave him a smile that Gerald would have recognized, the one I used to wear when I was about to negotiate a raise at the law firm or convince a stubborn contractor to fix something properly the first time. "Marcus, honey, normal people don't charge their mothers rent to live in their own homes. We stopped being normal people the minute your wife handed me that list." Chloe arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, punctual as always and dressed like she was attending a board meeting rather than a family discussion. Her navy suit was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless, her hair pulled back in that severe bun that made her look older and more intimidating than her 28 years warranted. She carried herself like a woman who expected to be taken seriously, which was ironic considering she was about to learn exactly how seriously I'd been taking her. "Velma," she said, pausing in the dining room doorway. "This is quite formal. Are we celebrating something?" "In a way," I replied, pulling out my chair at the head of the table where Gerald used to sit. "Please, both of you, have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." They exchanged a look as they settled into their chairs, Chloe confident and expectant, Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. I waited until they were both seated before I picked up the first document from my stack, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind them whose house they were sitting in. "Chloe," I began, my voice steady and clear, "earlier this week you presented me with what you called a household financial contribution agreement. You demanded that I pay you $300 a month to live in this house, plus additional fees for utilities and kitchen usage." She nodded, her expression professionally pleasant. "That's right. We thought it was time to formalize everyone's responsibilities." "I see. And this demand was based on your belief that Marcus co-owns this property?" "That's correct. Gerald put the house in both their names when Marcus turned 21. I picked up the deed and placed it on the table between us, turning it so they could both read the header clearly. This is the current deed to this property, filed with Jefferson County 3 years ago. Could you point out Marcus's name on this document?" Chloe leaned forward, her confidence faltering slightly as she scanned the legal language. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush that crept up her neck as she searched for a name that wasn't there. "I don't understand," she said. Finally, Marcus showed me the paperwork. He said his father put the house in both their names. I turned to my son, who was staring at the deed like it might change if he looked hard enough. "Marcus? Would you like to explain what paperwork you showed your wife?" His face had gone pale except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheekbones. There was something in Dad's filing cabinet. It looked like. I thought it was." "You thought it was what, exactly?" "A deed," he mumbled. "With my name on it." I reached for another document and placed it next to the first one. "This is a quitclaim deed, filed 3 years ago, transferring your father's half of the house to me. It was signed a month before he died, and it makes me the sole legal owner of this property. What you found in his filing cabinet was probably an old draft or a copy of the original mortgage from 1994, when you were 11 years old." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room. Chloe's professional composure was cracking around the edges, her eyes darting between the documents and Marcus's face like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. "But that doesn't change anything," she said finally, her voice higher than before. "Marcus still lives here. He still has rights as your son." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "He does have rights. He has the right to live in his childhood home as long as his mother chooses to let him. He has the right to be treated with love and respect as my son. He has the right to expect that this house will always be a safe place for him to come when he needs support or comfort." Chloe relaxed slightly, thinking she'd found solid ground. "However," I continued, "he does not have the right to charge me rent to live in my own house. He does not have the right to establish rules about when I can use my own living room. And he certainly does not have the right to threaten me with eviction if I don't comply with demands made by someone who has no legal authority whatsoever over this property." I reached for my rental market analysis and spread it across the table like I was dealing cards. "Since you're so interested in formalizing our living arrangement, Chloe, I thought you'd appreciate knowing what market rate would actually be for a house like this. Her eyes widened as she scanned the numbers. $1,800? That's ridiculous. No one pays that much for rent around here. Actually, they do. And that's for a house without the amenities you've been enjoying. Most rental properties don't include a live-in cook, housekeeper, and laundry service. Most landlords don't pay for groceries or utilities or the dozen other expenses I've been covering since you moved in. I pulled out my own household agreement and placed it in front of them, watching Chloe's face as she read the terms I'd outlined in the same precise language she'd used on me. So here's my proposal, I said, settling back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped playing defense. You can continue living in my house under the following conditions. Marcus and Chloe will pay fair market rent of $1,100 each per month, due on the first of every month. They will split utilities equally with the homeowner. They will purchase and prepare their own meals. They will do their own laundry and cleaning. And they will treat the homeowner with the respect due to someone who is both the legal property owner and Marcus's mother. Marcus found his voice first. Mom, we can't afford that. You know we can't. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before trying to charge me $300 to sleep in the bed where your father died, I replied calmly. Or maybe you should consider finding a place you can afford, since you're both employed adults who chose to move back in with family. Chloe had been reading my agreement with growing alarm, her professional facade finally cracking completely. This is insane. You can't just change everything because we hurt your feelings. I'm not changing anything because of hurt feelings, Chloe. I'm correcting a misunderstanding about who owns this house and who has the authority to make demands about rent and household rules. But we're family, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly on the word. I looked at my son, this man I'd carried and raised and loved unconditionally for 32 years, and felt my heart break just a little bit more. Family doesn't threaten each other with eviction, Marcus. Family doesn't try to turn their mother into a tenant in her own home. Family doesn't stand by silently while someone they love is being emotionally and financially abused. Abused? Chloe's voice rose to a near shriek. No one's abusing anyone. We were just trying to create some structure. You were trying to steal my house, I said flatly. Maybe not legally, since you don't have the brains or the paperwork to pull that off, but you were certainly trying to steal my dignity, my security, and my sense of home. You were trying to make me pay for the privilege of living in the place where I've built every important memory of my adult life. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 64 years in my bones but also feeling stronger than I had since Gerald's funeral. You have until Sunday to decide which of these options you prefer, paying fair market rent as my tenants, or finding somewhere else to live as my former house guests. Either way, the days of treating me like an inconvenience in my own life are over. Chloe shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor Gerald had installed himself 20 years ago. You can't do this. We have nowhere else to go. You had nowhere else to go 6 months ago, which is why I opened my home to you, I replied. But that was an act of love and generosity, not a legal obligation. I'm not required to house two adults who think it's appropriate to threaten and manipulate me. Marcus, Chloe turned to my son with desperation creeping into her voice. Say something. Don't let her do this to us. Marcus looked between his wife and his mother, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the boy who used to tell me everything and ask my advice about problems both big and small. But then his jaw tightened and he stood up beside his wife, choosing his side in the way that people do when they're too proud to admit they've made a mistake. Fine, Mom. If that's how you want it. But don't expect us to pretend everything's okay between us after this. Everything hasn't been okay between us since you let your wife treat me like hired help in my own house, I replied. At least now we're being honest about it. They left the dining room together, Chloe's heels clicking angrily on the floor and Marcus's heavy footsteps echoing like thunderclaps. I heard them arguing in the kitchen, then more stomping on the stairs, then the slam of their bedroom door that seemed to shake the whole house. I sat alone at the dining room table surrounded by legal documents and good china, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle around me like a familiar coat. Gerald's tie was still draped around my shoulders where I'd put it that morning. And I touched it gently as I listened to the sounds of my son and his wife fighting upstairs about money and mothers and the reality of actually having to pay for their choices. Tomorrow was Saturday. They had until Sunday to decide whether they wanted to be my tenants or my former house guests. Either way, I was no longer going to be a victim in my own life, and that felt like the kind of victory Gerald would have been proud of. I cleared the table slowly, washing the good china by hand the way my grandmother had taught me, taking care with each piece like it mattered. Because it did matter. Everything mattered now, in ways it hadn't when I was too tired and too sad to remember that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. Upstairs, the fighting had stopped, replaced by the sound of drawers being opened and closed with unnecessary force. I smiled as I dried my grandmother's plates, because whether they knew it or not, Marcus and Chloe were already packing. And I was finally, after 3 years of grief and 6 months of being made to feel like a stranger in my own life, coming home. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of Chloe's voice carrying through the walls like a siren, sharp and insistent. As she spoke to someone on the phone in their bedroom. I caught fragments through the heating vents that connected our rooms, enough to understand she was calling in favors and exploring options with the desperation of someone who'd just discovered their safety net had holes in it. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and settled at the table with the newspaper, reading each section thoroughly like I had all the time in the world. Because I did have all the time in the world. This was my house, my kitchen, my morning routine, and for the first time in months, no one was rushing me or making demands or treating me like an inconvenience in my own life. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus appeared in the doorway looking like he hadn't slept much. His hair was sticking up at odd angles and his eyes were rimmed with red, whether from lack of sleep or something stronger, I couldn't tell. He poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly and sat across from me without making eye contact. "Morning," he mumbled into his cup. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, not looking up from the crossword puzzle I was working on. "Sleep well?" He made a noise that wasn't quite a laugh. "Not really. We were up most of the night talking." "About?" "You know what about, Mom. About this whole mess you've created." I set down my pen and looked at him directly, this man who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him and tell me his dreams about building bridges that would connect distant places. "Marcus, the only mess I've created is holding you accountable for trying to financially exploit your own mother. Everything else is just consequences. We weren't exploiting you. We were trying to make things fair." Fair would have been asking me if I needed help with expenses instead of demanding payment for housing you don't own. Fair would have been contributing to household costs instead of adding to them. Fair would have been treating me like family, instead of like a burden you could charge rent to manage. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. Gerald used to do the same thing when he was overwhelmed, dragging his palms down his cheeks like he could wipe away whatever was troubling him. "Chloe's parents think we should get our own place," he said finally. "That might be the first sensible thing they've suggested since I've known them." "Mom, come on. You're being unfair. You know we can't afford rent anywhere decent, not with my income and her student loans." I folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving him my full attention. "Marcus, when your father and I got married, we lived in a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage for 2 years while we saved for a house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and we were proud of it because we were building something together. That was different. Everything was cheaper then. Everything was proportionally cheaper, but we were also making proportionally less money. Your father was making $8 an hour at the construction company, and I was making $5.50 as a secretary. We ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches and drove cars that broke down more often than they ran, but we didn't expect anyone else to subsidize our choices." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So what, you want us to live in some dump because we can't afford what you think we should pay?" "I want you to live within your means like every other adult in the world. If that means a smaller place or a longer commute or making sacrifices until you can afford better, then that's what grown-ups do. They don't move in with family and then try to make that family pay for the privilege of housing them. But we're not strangers, Mom. We're your son and daughter-in-law. Which should have made you more considerate of my situation, not less. Which should have made you grateful for my generosity, not entitled to my resources." Chloe's voice drifted down from upstairs, still on the phone, her tone shifting between wheedling and demanding as she worked through what sounded like a list of people who might solve her immediate housing problem. I caught my name several times, along with words like unreasonable and vindictive and impossible to deal with. It was interesting how quickly gratitude turned to resentment when the free ride ended. "She's scared," Marcus said, following my gaze toward the ceiling. "This whole thing has really shaken her up. She should be scared. She tried to defraud a 64-year-old widow and got caught. Fear is an appropriate response to discovering that actions have consequences. She wasn't trying to defraud anyone. She just misunderstood the ownership situation." I leaned back in my chair and studied my son's face, looking for signs of the intelligent, compassionate boy I'd raised. "Marcus, do you honestly believe that? Do you really think your wife's mistake was innocent confusion about property law?" His eyes slid away from mine. "I think she was trying to create some structure in a complicated situation. By demanding that I pay her money to live in my own house? By making sure everyone's responsibilities were clear." "Whose responsibilities, Marcus?" Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she was trying to make my responsibility to pay her while her responsibility was to. What exactly? Grace me with her presence? Allow me to continue sleeping in the bedroom where I've slept for 30 years? The sound of Chloe's conversation upstairs had taken on a more frantic quality, her voice rising and falling like she was pleading with whoever was on the other end of the line. I heard the word emergency several times, followed by long pauses that suggested the person she was talking to wasn't as sympathetic as she'd hoped they'd be. Look, Mom, I know this got out of hand. Maybe Chloe was too aggressive about the whole thing. But can't we just forget about it and go back to how things were? How things were? I repeated slowly. You mean when your wife treated me like an unwelcome guest in my own home? When she made snide comments about my cooking and my clothes and my life choices? When she acted like I was lucky to be tolerated in the house where I've lived longer than she's been alive? She doesn't mean it personally. That's just how she talks. Marcus, listen to yourself. You're making excuses for someone who tried to extort money from your mother. You're defending behavior that you would never accept from anyone else toward anyone else, but somehow it's okay when it's directed at me. He flinched like I'd slapped him, but he didn't deny it. What do you want me to do, Mom? Leave my wife? Choose between you and her? I want you to be the man your father and I raised you to be. I want you to stand up for what's right instead of going along with what's easy. I want you to remember that love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior, it means caring enough to call it out. Upstairs, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows, followed by the sound of Chloe's heels clicking rapidly across the hardwood floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, her phone still pressed to her ear and her face flushed with anger and frustration. I have to call you back, she said into the phone, then hung up and turned to face us with the expression of someone who'd just been told that all her credit cards had been cancelled. Having trouble finding alternative accommodations? I asked. Mildly. Her jaw tightened. My parents think I should apologize to you. That's interesting. What do you think? I think this whole situation is ridiculous. I think you're being petty and vindictive over what amounts to a simple misunderstanding about property ownership. I nodded thoughtfully. So you're not planning to apologize? For what? For trying to bring some organization to a household that was running without any structure? For suggesting that adults should contribute financially to their living expenses? For treating you like a capable person instead of a helpless victim who needs to be coddled? Marcus winced at his wife's tone, but he didn't interrupt her. I waited until she was finished before responding, taking my time like Gerald used to do when someone was making a fool of themselves and he wanted to give them every opportunity to realize it. Chloe, you demanded that I pay you money to live in my own house. You threatened me with eviction if I didn't comply with rules you had no authority to make. You treated me like a tenant in property I own outright while you enjoyed free housing, utilities, food, and housekeeping services. That's not organization or structure, that's exploitation. We were going to pay you back once we got on our feet. Pay me back for what? For the privilege of charging me rent? For the favor of taking over my living room and making me ask permission to use my own kitchen? Her composure cracked a little more. We never said you couldn't use the kitchen. You charged me $25 for kitchen usage fees. That was just to cover the extra groceries and utilities. The groceries I've been buying for all of us for 6 months? The utilities I've been paying in the house I own? Chloe's face was getting redder by the minute, but she pressed on with the determination of someone who'd never learned when to stop digging. Fine. Maybe we approached it wrong. But you can't just kick us out over a miscommunication. I'm not kicking you out over a miscommunication. I'm giving you the same choice you gave me, pay fair market rent or find somewhere else to live. The only difference is that my demands are based on actual ownership of the property and actual market rates for comparable housing. We can't afford $1,100 each. You know that. Then I suggest you start looking for something within your budget. Because as of Monday morning, if you're still living here without a signed lease agreement and first month's rent, you'll be trespassing on private property. Marcus finally found his voice. Mom, you can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go? The same place any other couple goes when they need housing they can afford. Apartment hunting. Roommate situations. Extended stay motels if necessary. The world is full of options for people willing to live within their means. But this is my childhood home, he said, his voice breaking slightly. This is supposed to be my safe place. My heart clenched at the pain in his voice, but I forced myself to stay strong. It will always be your safe place, Marcus. But safety doesn't mean freedom from consequences. It doesn't mean you get to take advantage of people who love you without being held accountable. So that's it? You're just going to throw us out? I'm going to stop enabling behavior that's harmful to all of us. I'm going to stop pretending that love means accepting disrespect and manipulation. I'm going to start requiring that the people in my life treat me with the same consideration I show them." Chloe had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, and now she exploded with the fury of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "This is insane. You're destroying your own family over money. Over pride. Do you know how pathetic that makes you look?" "What makes me look pathetic," I replied calmly, "is the fact that I allowed my son's wife to treat me like garbage in my own home for 6 months before I finally grew a spine and did something about it." "We never treated you like garbage. You tried to charge me rent to sleep in the bed where my husband died. If that's not treating someone like garbage, I'd hate to see what you consider actual mistreatment." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. Chloe and Marcus stood frozen in the doorway like deer caught in headlights, finally beginning to understand that their bluff had been called and their safety net had vanished. "Fine," Chloe said finally, her voice sharp with defeat and rage. "We'll be out by tomorrow night. But don't expect this to be the end of it. Don't expect us to just forget how you treated us when we needed help." "I treated you exactly how you treated me," I replied. "The only difference is that I had the legal right to do it." She spun on her heel and stalked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the house like gunshots. Marcus lingered for a moment, looking lost and uncertain, like a child who'd been separated from his parents in a crowded store. "Mom, I really hoped it wouldn't come to this." "So did I, sweetheart. So did I." He followed his wife upstairs. And within minutes I could hear them moving around their room with the particular rhythm of people packing in a hurry. Drawers slamming, closet doors banging, the sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor. It was the sound of my son leaving home for the second time in his life, but this time there was no excitement about new adventures or proud parents helping him load boxes into a truck. This time there was just anger and resentment and the bitter taste of a relationship that might never recover. I finished my coffee and started on the dishes, taking my time with each cup and plate like I was performing a meditation. The kitchen window looked out onto the backyard where Gerald had built a swing set for Marcus when he was 5, where we'd hosted birthday parties and barbecues and lazy summer evenings when life seemed simple and full of possibility. The swing set was gone now, replaced by the flower garden I'd planted after Gerald died, but I could still see the worn spots in the grass where it used to stand. By noon, the house had taken on the particular quality of sound that comes with serious packing. Not the casual tidying of people preparing for a vacation, but the systematic dismantling of a temporary life. I could hear them talking in short, clipped sentences about what to take and what to leave, about logistics and timelines and who to call for help with the heavy furniture they'd brought from their previous apartment. Around 2 o'clock, Mrs. Chen appeared at my front door carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching interesting developments through her kitchen window. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, handing me the dish. "Looks like you've got some activity over there." "Marcus and Chloe have decided to find their own place," I said, accepting the casserole gratefully. "Tuna noodle? With the good cheese, the way you like it. And might I say, it's about time that girl learned she can't treat people like doormats just because they're family." We sat on my front porch with glasses of iced tea, watching a U-Haul truck pull into my driveway, followed by a sedan I didn't recognize. 2 young men got out of the sedan, both wearing the particular combination of resignation and obligation that suggested they were friends who'd been pressed into moving duty. "She called in reinforcements," Mrs. Chen observed. "Apparently she found someone willing to help on short notice. Probably promised them pizza and beer. That's how young people always pay for moving help these days." Chloe emerged from the house directing the operation like a general commanding troops, pointing toward boxes and furniture with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this before. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of her usual business attire, but she still managed to look like she was in charge of the situation rather than fleeing from it. Marcus appeared carrying a dresser, his face red with exertion and something that might have been embarrassment. He glanced toward the porch where Mrs. Chen and I were sitting, but he didn't wave or acknowledge us in any way. Just loaded the dresser into the truck and went back inside for the next load. "That boy looks miserable," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "He should look miserable. He chose this." "Still your son, though." "Still my son," I agreed. "But being my son doesn't give him the right to treat me like a tenant in my own home." The packing continued through the afternoon, a steady parade of belongings being carried from my house to the truck. Clothes and electronics and kitchen gadgets I'd never seen before, furniture that had somehow accumulated in their room without my noticing. It was amazing how much stuff 2 people could acquire in 6 months, especially when they weren't paying rent or utilities. Around 4 o'clock, one of Chloe's helpers came to the front door looking apologetic and slightly nervous. He was maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else but had been guilted into helping. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said when I answered the door. "Chloe asked me to get the security deposit back for them? She said you'd have it ready." I blinked at him slowly, wondering if I'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what security deposit? For the room? She said they paid you a security deposit when they moved in and you'd have it ready for when they moved out." Behind him, I could see Chloe standing by the truck, watching our conversation with the focused attention of someone who'd sent her proxy to collect something she knew she wasn't entitled to. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "Young man," I said gently, "I'm Marcus's mother. This is my house. They didn't pay me a security deposit because they weren't tenants, they were family members who I allowed to live here rent-free for 6 months. There's no deposit to return because there was never any deposit paid." His face went through several expressions as he processed this information, landing on a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding that he'd been sent to collect money that didn't exist. "Oh. Should I tell her that?" "You can tell her exactly what I told you. And you can also tell her that if she has any questions about deposits or any other financial matters related to this property, she can contact my attorney." I handed him Tom's business card from the stack I'd prepared for this exact moment. He took the card and walked back to the truck, where I could see him having what appeared to be an uncomfortable conversation with Chloe. Her voice rose sharply. Enough for me to catch a few choice words that would have gotten her mouth washed out with soap when I was her age. The young man shrugged apologetically and handed her the business card, then went back to loading boxes with renewed vigor, probably hoping to finish the job and escape before he got dragged into any more awkward situations. By 6 o'clock, the truck was loaded and the sedan was packed full of the remaining items that wouldn't fit. Chloe stood in my driveway doing a final inventory while Marcus made one last trip through the house, presumably checking for anything they'd forgotten. When he came back outside, he stood by the truck for a moment looking at the house like he was memorizing it. Mrs. Chen had gone home an hour earlier, but not before pressing my hand and telling me I'd done the right thing. "Sometimes love means letting people fall down so they can learn to pick themselves up," she'd said, and I was holding on to those words as I watched my son prepare to drive out of my life. Chloe got into the passenger seat of the sedan without looking back, but Marcus walked slowly toward the porch where I was sitting. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking younger than his 32 years. "I guess this is it," he said. "I guess it is. Are you happy now? Getting what you wanted?" I considered the question seriously. "Marcus, what I wanted was for my son to treat me with respect and for his wife to stop trying to exploit me financially. What I got was the knowledge that you're both willing to move out rather than behave like decent human beings. So no, I'm not happy. I'm sad and disappointed and worried about what kind of people you're becoming." He scuffed his shoe against the concrete step. "We found a place. It's not great, but it's temporary." "I'm glad you found something. It's a studio apartment above a laundromat. We'll be sleeping on an air mattress until we can afford a real bed." There was something in his voice that suggested he wanted me to feel guilty about their reduced circumstances, to offer them money or invite them back or apologize for holding them accountable for their choices. Instead, I said, "That sounds like the kind of place your father and I would have been grateful for when we were starting out. This isn't how I wanted things to end between us." "Then you should have made different choices. You should have stood up to your wife when she started treating me badly. You should have contributed to household expenses instead of adding to them. You should have acted like my son instead of like her accomplice." "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I screwed this up. Maybe isn't good enough anymore, Marcus. Either you know you screwed up or you don't. Either you're ready to take responsibility for your choices or you're still making excuses." He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw something that looked like the boy who used to apologize for breaking windows and tracking mud on clean floors. But then Chloe honked the horn from the car, and the moment passed. "I have to go," he said. "You always have a choice about who you have to answer to." He nodded once, then walked back to the truck without saying goodbye. I watched him drive away, following the sedan down Maple Grove Drive toward whatever uncertain future they'd chosen instead of swallowing their pride and treating me with basic human decency. The house felt different when they were gone. Not emptier, exactly, but quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise levels. It was the silence of a place where people had been living under false pretenses, where tension had been masquerading as family harmony, where respect had been absent so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to have it. I walked through each room, slowly, noting what they'd left behind and what they'd taken. The guest bathroom still smelled like Chloe's expensive shampoo. The bedroom where they'd slept still had marks in the carpet where their dresser had stood. But already the house was beginning to feel like mine again, like a place where I could breathe without walking on eggshells. In the kitchen, I found a note propped against the coffee maker, written in Marcus's handwriting on a piece of paper torn from one of his work notebooks. "Mom, I'm sorry it came to this. I hope someday you'll understand that we were trying to help. Love, Marcus." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with the other documents from this strange week. He was sorry it came to this, but not sorry for what he'd done. He thought they were trying to help, but couldn't see how charging me rent to live in my own house was actually harm. He loved me, but not enough to choose me over a woman who'd tried to exploit me. It wasn't the apology I'd hoped for, but it was honest in its way. It told me exactly where I stood with my son and exactly what I could expect from him going forward. And sometimes clarity, even painful clarity, was worth more than false hope. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table while the sun set outside the window where Gerald had hung that crystal 30 years ago. The rainbows it cast were softer in the evening light, more gentle somehow, like a benediction on a day that had been harder than it needed to be but necessary. All the same. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow I would wake up in my own house as the sole resident for the first time since Gerald died. Tomorrow I would drink my coffee without anyone demanding payment for kitchen usage and eat my breakfast without anyone making snide comments about my cooking. Tomorrow I would start figuring out what the rest of my life looked like when it was truly mine to live. But tonight, I sat in the kitchen where I'd raised my son and loved my husband and learned to be strong enough to stand up for myself. Tonight, I listened to the familiar sounds of an old house settling into evening quiet. Tonight, I was home in every sense of the word, and that was enough. The first 2 weeks after Marcus and Chloe moved out passed in a strange rhythm of relief and loneliness that I hadn't anticipated. The house felt bigger somehow, like rooms had expanded back to their original dimensions after being compressed by the weight of resentment and tension. I could cook what I wanted when I wanted it, watch television programs that didn't require anyone's approval, and use my own bathroom without finding expensive skincare products covering every available surface. But silence, I discovered, could be both a blessing and a curse. The same quiet that felt like freedom during the day sometimes felt like abandonment in the evening hours when I was used to hearing voices upstairs, even angry voices arguing about money and obligations. Gerald had been gone for 3 years. But Marcus and Chloe's presence had masked just how alone I really was in this house that had once been full of family dinners and homework help and the comfortable chaos of people who belonged together. I was learning to fill the silence with small rituals that belonged entirely to me. Morning coffee on the front porch while reading the newspaper from cover to cover. Afternoon gardening sessions that stretched as long as I wanted them to without anyone complaining about dirt tracked through the kitchen. Evening phone calls with my sister Ruth, who'd been calling every few days since she'd heard about the confrontation through some mysterious network of church ladies and neighborhood gossip. "You did the right thing," Ruth said during one of these conversations, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been proven right about a situation she'd been monitoring from a distance. "That girl was poisoned from the day Marcus brought her home, and he was too smitten to see it." "I just wish it hadn't come to this," I replied, settling into Gerald's old recliner with a cup of chamomile tea. "I wish he'd found his backbone before it got so ugly. Some people have to lose everything before they appreciate what they had. Maybe this will be good for him in the long run." I hoped Ruth was right, but the stubborn silence from Marcus suggested otherwise. No phone calls, no text messages. No indication that he was reconsidering his choices or missing the home he'd walked away from rather than treat his mother with basic respect. It was like he'd vanished from my life as completely as if he'd moved to another state instead of just across town to a studio apartment above a laundromat. Mrs. Chen had become my unofficial intelligence network, reporting sightings of Marcus's truck at the grocery store or gas station with the detailed attention of someone who understood that mothers never really stopped worrying about their children, even when those children disappointed them. She'd seen him twice at the Walmart, once buying what looked like cleaning supplies and once in the pharmacy section looking tired and stressed. "That boy's lost weight," she told me one morning when she brought over extra tomatoes from her garden. "Chloe too. They both look like they're not eating right." I accepted the tomatoes gratefully and tried not to think about Marcus going hungry because he was too proud to ask for help or too stubborn to admit he'd made a mistake. It wasn't my responsibility to worry about his meals anymore, I reminded myself. He was a grown man who'd chosen his wife over his mother, and grown men dealt with the consequences of their choices. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things, and I couldn't completely silence the part of me that wanted to cook a casserole and leave it on his doorstep with a note saying I loved him despite everything. The only thing that stopped me was the memory of Chloe's voice saying I was pathetic for caring about money and pride, and the knowledge that enabling their poor choices wouldn't help anyone in the long run. It was on a Thursday morning, exactly 16 days after they'd moved out, that I got the first indication that their new living situation wasn't the adventure and independence they'd hoped it would be. I was watering the hanging baskets on my front porch when an unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway, a small sedan that had seen better days and sported a dent in the front bumper that suggested recent contact with something immovable. The woman who got out of the car was around my age, maybe a few years younger, with graying brown hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she didn't waste time on appearances. She walked toward me with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, and something about her expression made me set down my watering can and give her my full attention. "Are you Velma Stone?" she asked when she reached the bottom of my porch steps. "I am. Can I help you?" "I'm Patricia Marsh, Chloe's mother. I think we need to talk." I gestured toward the wicker chairs on my porch, the same chairs where I'd sat with Mrs. Chen while watching Marcus and Chloe pack their belongings into a U-Haul truck. "Would you like some iced tea? It's getting warm out here." She accepted the offer, and I went inside to prepare 2 glasses, using the time to wonder what had brought Chloe's mother to my doorstep. I'd met Patricia briefly at Marcus and Chloe's wedding 3 years ago, where she'd seemed pleasant enough in the distant way of people who were being polite for the sake of the occasion. She'd worked as a bank manager before retiring, I remembered, and had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with financial problems and people who created them. When I returned with the tea, Patricia was sitting in the shade looking at my flower garden with the appreciation of someone who understood the work that went into maintaining something beautiful. She accepted her glass with a nod of thanks and took a long sip before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, "for my daughter's behavior and for the situation that brought us all to this point." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas, but all I saw was the tired honesty of a mother who'd been dealing with a difficult child longer than she cared to admit. "I appreciate that, but you're not responsible for Chloe's choices, aren't I?" Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm the one who raised her to think the world owed her something. I'm the one who bailed her out of financial trouble so many times she never learned to live within her means. I'm the one who taught her that charm and manipulation could substitute for character and responsibility." She set her glass down on the small table between our chairs and looked at me directly. "Chloe called me the day after they moved out, crying and carrying on about how cruel you'd been, how unreasonable your demands were, how you'd thrown them out of their home over a simple misunderstanding." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her she was a fool if she thought I was going to feel sorry for her. I told her that trying to charge an elderly woman rent to live in her own home was despicable, and that if she'd pulled that nonsense with anyone else, she'd probably be facing criminal charges." The bluntness of Patricia's words surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness or attempts to minimize what had happened, not this frank acknowledgement of her daughter's behavior. How did she respond to that? "About like you'd expect. Tears, accusations that everyone was against her, threats to cut me out of her life if I didn't support her." Patricia picked up her tea again and took another sip. "I told her that might not be the worst thing that could happen to me at this point." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 mothers who discovered that loving your children didn't mean you had to approve of their choices or enable their worst impulses. The morning was heating up, but the porch stayed cool under the shade of the maple tree Gerald had planted when we first moved into the house. "They're struggling," Patricia said eventually. "The apartment is barely habitable, and they're both working extra hours just to afford it. Chloe's been calling everyone she knows asking for loans, and Marcus looks like he hasn't slept in weeks." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "But they made their choice." "They did. And they're learning some hard lessons about what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." Patricia leaned forward slightly. "But I didn't come here to ask you to take them back or to feel sorry for them. I came to ask you something else entirely." "What's that?" "I want to know if you'd be interested in renting Marcus's old room to someone who would actually appreciate it and pay fair market value for the privilege." I blinked, not sure I'd heard correctly. "You want to rent my guest room?" "Not me. My nephew David. He's 26, works as a nurse at the county hospital, and he's been looking for a quiet place to live while he saves money for a house down payment. He's responsible, clean, respectful, and he understands that being someone's tenant means following their rules and paying your rent on time." The idea was so unexpected that I needed a moment to process it. "Why would you want to help me find a tenant after what happened with your daughter?" Patricia's smile was rueful. "Because I raised one child who thinks the world owes her everything. And I'd like to help raise another one who understands that good things come to people who earn them. David's a good kid who deserves a decent place to live, and you're a good woman who deserves tenants who will treat you with respect. What would Chloe think about this arrangement?" "Honestly? She'd be furious. She'd see it as a betrayal. And probably cut me off completely." Patricia shrugged. At this point, that might be a blessing in disguise. I'm tired of being treated like an ATM by a daughter who only calls when she needs money or wants someone to validate her poor choices. I found myself liking Patricia more with each exchange. She had the straightforward honesty of someone who'd run out of patience for drama and excuses, and her offer was intriguing on multiple levels. The practical part of me recognized that rental income would be welcome, especially with the rising costs of utilities and property taxes. The emotional part of me was attracted to the idea of having someone in the house who might actually appreciate living here instead of treating it like a burden they were forced to endure. "Tell me about David," I said. Patricia's face brightened. The way grandmothers' faces do when they get to talk about grandchildren they're proud of. "He's my sister's youngest son. Lost his mother to cancer 2 years ago and moved here from Ohio to be closer to family. He works night shifts in the cardiac unit at the hospital, so he sleeps during the day and keeps odd hours, but he's quiet as a mouse and clean as a whistle. And he's looking for a room rather than his own place because he's smart. With money. He could afford a small apartment, but he'd rather save the extra money for a house down payment than spend it on rent for a place he doesn't really need. He's been staying with me since he moved here, but my guest room is tiny and he's a big guy. 6'3" and built like his grandfather." The more Patricia talked about David, the more appealing the arrangement sounded. A working professional. Who kept quiet hours, paid his bills on time, and had family in the area vouching for his character. Someone who would view living in my home as a privilege rather than a right, who would contribute to household expenses instead of adding to them. What kind of rent would he be looking to pay? Whatever's fair. He knows what apartments go for around here, and he's prepared to pay market rate for a furnished room in a nice neighborhood. He's also handy with repairs and maintenance if you need help with anything around the house. I thought about the guest room that had been Marcus's childhood bedroom, empty now except for the twin bed and dresser he'd left behind when he moved out. It was a good-sized room with its own bathroom and plenty of natural light, certainly worth more than the $300 Chloe had tried to charge me for living in my own house. Would he be interested in meeting me? Maybe seeing the room. And discussing terms? Are you kidding? He'd be thrilled. I've been telling him about this neighborhood for weeks, and when I mentioned what happened with Marcus and Chloe, he said he'd love the chance to show you what a real tenant looks like. We spent another hour on the porch discussing practical details and getting to know each other better. Patricia had been married for 35 years to a man who'd passed away 5 years ago, had raised 3 children who varied widely in their levels of responsibility and gratitude, and had recently decided that her retirement years were too precious to waste on ungrateful people who took her generosity for granted. "Life's too short to keep enabling bad behavior," she said as she prepared to leave. "I should have stopped bailing Chloe out of trouble years ago, but I kept hoping she'd grow out of it. Now I know better." "What changed your mind?" "Watching what she tried to do to you. Seeing her attempt to exploit a widow who'd opened her home to family out of love and generosity." Patricia shook her head. "That's when I realized I hadn't raised a daughter with temporary problems, I'd raised a daughter with character defects. And character defects don't get better with age, they get worse." After Patricia left, I walked through the house with new eyes, considering what it would be like to have a tenant who actually wanted to be there. Someone who would pay rent without resentment, follow house rules without arguing, and treat me like a landlord instead of like an obstacle to their comfort. The idea was appealing enough that I found myself already planning how to prepare the room for a potential occupant. That afternoon, I called Tom to discuss the legal aspects of becoming a landlord and the protections I should put in place for both myself and any future tenant. He was enthusiastic about the idea, especially after I explained the family connection and Patricia's vouching for her nephew's character. "It sounds perfect, Velma. Much better than leaving the room empty or, God forbid, letting Marcus and Chloe back in to take advantage of you again." Tom's voice carried the satisfaction of an attorney who'd seen a good plan come together. "I'll draft a standard lease agreement that protects your interests while being fair to the tenant. And I'll include clauses about house rules, quiet enjoyment, and termination procedures so everyone knows exactly what's expected." "What about references and background checks?" "Absolutely. Even with family recommendations, you want to verify employment, check credit history, and make sure there are no red flags in his background. It's nothing personal, just good business practice." That evening, I called Patricia to arrange a meeting with David for the following Saturday. She was delighted and promised to have him call me directly to set up a time that worked for both of us. When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, anticipation for positive change instead of dread about what drama might unfold next. David called the next morning, and his voice immediately impressed me with its politeness and professionalism. He had the kind of phone manner that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with people in stressful situations and knew how to be both respectful and reassuring. Mrs. Stone, I really appreciate you considering me as a tenant. Aunt Patricia speaks very highly of you, and I'd love the opportunity to see the room and discuss your expectations. We arranged to meet Saturday afternoon, and he offered to bring references from his previous landlord in Ohio as well as employment verification from the hospital. The fact that he'd thought to prepare these documents without being asked spoke well of his understanding of the rental process and his respect for my position as a property owner. Saturday morning, I spent extra time cleaning the guest room and bathroom, not because they were dirty but because I wanted to present the space at its best. I also prepared a list of house rules and expectations, learning from my experience with Marcus and Chloe that clarity from the beginning prevented misunderstandings later. David arrived exactly on time, driving a well-maintained pickup truck that suggested he took care of his possessions. He was indeed tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of solid build that comes from physical work rather than gym memberships. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes were clean and pressed, and he carried himself with the confident posture of someone comfortable in his own skin. Mrs. Stone? He offered his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. I'm David Marsh. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his eyes made direct contact in the way that suggested honesty and confidence. He had Patricia's straightforward manner but tempered with the gentle approach I associated with healthcare professionals who dealt with anxious patients and worried families. Please, call me Velma. Would you like to see the room first, or would you prefer to sit and talk about expectations? Whatever you'd prefer. I'm grateful for the opportunity either way. I showed him through the house, pointing out common areas and explaining my routines and preferences. He listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions about things like laundry schedules and kitchen usage, and made comments that showed he was thinking about how to be a considerate housemate rather than just a tenant who paid rent. The guest room clearly impressed him. He examined the space with the attention of someone who understood the value of natural light, adequate storage, and privacy. The attached bathroom drew particular appreciation, and he mentioned that his current living situation involved sharing a bathroom with Patricia's husband's elderly father, who had moved in after a hip surgery. This is beautiful, he said, looking out the window that faced the backyard garden. And so quiet. At Aunt Patricia's, there's always something going on. Not that I'm complaining, he added quickly, but when you work 12-hour night shifts, sleep becomes pretty precious. We sat at the kitchen table to discuss practical matters, and David produced a folder of documents that was more thorough than what many apartment complexes required. Employment verification, pay stubs, bank statements, references from his previous landlord and several colleagues at the hospital. He'd even included a letter of recommendation from his nursing supervisor that described him as reliable, professional, and well-regarded by both patients and staff. I believe in being upfront about everything, he explained as I reviewed his paperwork. I know you have every reason to be cautious after what happened with your son and his wife. Aunt Patricia told me a little about the situation, and I want you to know that I understand the difference between being a guest and being a tenant. What kind of rent were you thinking would be fair? I asked. I've been looking at comparable situations, and I think $700 a month would be reasonable for a furnished room with private bath in this neighborhood. Plus my share of utilities, of course, and I'm happy to contribute to household supplies like cleaning products and paper goods. His offer was more than fair, and his attitude was everything I could have hoped for in a tenant. We discussed house rules, schedules, and expectations, and David's responses showed both respect for my position as the homeowner and understanding of what it meant to share living space with someone else. I should probably mention that I'm a pretty boring tenant, he said with a self-deprecating laugh. I work, I sleep, I read, and I watch too much Netflix. No parties, no overnight guests without permission, no loud music or late-night phone calls. The most exciting thing about my lifestyle is that I sometimes make pancakes at 2 in the morning when I get home from work. That sounds perfect, actually. And pancakes at 2 in the morning sounds like something Gerald would have done when he worked night shifts at the construction company. Gerald was your husband? For 30 years. He passed away 3 years ago. David's expression softened with the kind of sympathy that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. I'm sorry for your loss. Aunt Patricia mentioned that you'd been widowed. It must be difficult, especially with the family situation on top of everything else. It has been challenging, I admitted. But I'm learning that sometimes difficult situations teach us things about ourselves that we needed to know. Like how strong you are when you have to be. I looked at this young man who barely knew me but had somehow understood something that my own son had missed entirely. Exactly like that. We shook hands on a month-to-month lease agreement with the understanding that Tom would prepare the formal paperwork and David would move in the following weekend. As he prepared to leave, David paused at the front door and looked back at the house with something that looked like genuine appreciation. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Velma. I promise you won't regret it." "I don't think I will," I replied, and meant it. After David left, I called Patricia to let her know that her nephew had made an excellent impression and that we'd agreed on terms for him to move in. She was delighted, but not surprised. "David's always been the kind of person who makes you feel better about humanity," she said. "His mother raised him right, and losing her just made him more appreciative of the good people left in his life." "What do you think Chloe will say when she finds out?" Patricia laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in it. "She'll probably have a complete meltdown. She'll see it as the ultimate betrayal and proof that everyone in the family is against her." Which, to be honest, might not be far from the truth at this point. Are you prepared for that? Velma, I've been dealing with Chloe's meltdowns for 28 years. At this point, I'm more worried about David being happy and you feeling safe and respected in your own home than I am about managing my daughter's emotional reactions to other people's good fortune. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine and Gerald's old tie draped around my shoulders, watching the sun set behind the trees that lined Maple Grove Drive. In a week, there would be someone new living in my house, someone who would pay rent without resentment and follow rules without argument. Someone who understood that respect was a two-way street and that gratitude was an appropriate response to generosity. Mrs. Chen appeared on her own porch with a watering can, and we waved to each other across the street like neighbors do when they've shared enough conversations to be comfortable with small gestures of acknowledgement. She'd been my witness through the difficult weeks with Marcus and Chloe, and I knew she'd be just as invested in seeing how this new chapter unfolded. Tomorrow I would start preparing for David's arrival, but tonight I was content to sit in the gathering darkness and appreciate how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. I'd gone from being a victim of financial manipulation to being a landlord who could choose her tenants. I'd gone from being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own home to being recognized as the property owner who set the rules. I'd gone from enabling bad behavior to establishing boundaries that protected my dignity and my resources. It wasn't the life I'd planned when Gerald was alive and we dreamed about grandchildren visiting during school breaks and family holidays that brought everyone together under our roof. But it was a life I was building deliberately, with intention and self-respect, and that felt like victory enough for now. The porch light came on automatically as darkness settled over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow over the chairs where I'd confronted my son's entitlement and met my future tenants' appreciation. In a week, those same chairs would host conversations about rent payments and house rules and the dozens of small negotiations that made shared living work when both parties approached it with honesty and mutual respect. I was looking forward to it with an anticipation I hadn't felt in years, the kind of hopeful expectation that came from knowing I'd made good choices and surrounded myself with people who valued what I had to offer. It was a new kind of family, built on choice rather than obligation, and it felt like coming home to myself after a long journey through other people's definitions of who I should be and what I should accept. Gerald's tie was warm against my shoulders, a reminder that love didn't always look like enabling and that protection sometimes meant teaching people the consequences of their choices. He would have been proud of me, I thought, for finally learning the difference between being kind and being a doormat. He would have approved of David, with his straightforward manner and his understanding that good things came to people who earned them. And he would have been glad to know that his house, the one we'd built our life in together, was going to continue being a home for people who appreciated its value and respected the woman who owned it. David moved in on a crisp September morning. That felt like the beginning of something hopeful rather than the continuation of something broken. He arrived with 2 friends and a modest U-Haul trailer, bringing only what he truly needed: clothes, books, a small television, and the kind of personal belongings that spoke of someone who valued quality over quantity. Unlike the chaotic exodus of Marcus and Chloe, David's move-in was organized, respectful, and completed without drama or demands for assistance I hadn't offered. I watched from the kitchen window as he carried his possessions upstairs, noting how he paused to wipe his feet before entering the house and how he directed his friends to be careful around my furniture and decorations. When they were finished, he knocked on the kitchen door frame and asked if there was anything he could help me with before his friends left. It was such a small gesture, but it represented everything that had been missing from my interactions with Marcus and Chloe. "Thank you, but I think I'm fine," I said, genuinely touched by the offer. "How does the room look with your things in it?" "Like home," he replied with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face. "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity, Velma. I promise you won't regret trusting me." Within a week, it became clear that David was exactly the kind of tenant every landlord hoped to find. He was quiet during his sleep hours, cleaned up after himself without being asked, and paid his first month's rent along with a security deposit 3 days early. He left thoughtful notes when he used something from the common areas, asking permission, rather than assuming privilege, and he always knocked before entering spaces that weren't specifically his. More than that, he brought a presence to the house that felt like comfort rather than tension. When he was home between shifts, I could hear him moving around upstairs with the careful consideration of someone who understood that other people lived below him. Sometimes I caught the faint sound of classical music drifting down through the vents, nothing loud enough to disturb but enough to remind me that the house was occupied by someone who appreciated beautiful things. On his nights off, David often sat on the front porch reading medical journals or thick novels that suggested a mind hungry for knowledge and growth. We fell into a pattern of brief conversations when our schedules overlapped, discussions about books and gardening and the small observations that neighbors share when they're comfortable with each other's presence. It was during one of these porch conversations that David mentioned he'd heard from his Aunt Patricia about developments in Marcus and Chloe's situation. They'd been evicted from the studio apartment after falling behind on rent, and were currently staying with Chloe's brother in a cramped 2-bedroom house that already contained his family of 4. Aunt Patricia says Chloe's been calling everyone in the family asking for money, David said, his voice carrying the disapproval of someone who understood the difference between genuine need and manufactured crisis. She's claiming you ruined their lives by forcing them out of their home. Their home, I repeated, noting the irony. The same home where they tried to charge me rent to live in my own bedroom. The story changes depending on who she's talking to. Sometimes you threw them out without warning, sometimes you demanded impossible amounts of money, sometimes you were mentally incompetent and being manipulated by scheming relatives. David shook his head. It's amazing how creative people get when they're trying to avoid taking responsibility for their own choices. I wasn't surprised by Chloe's revisionist history, but hearing it secondhand still stung. What does Patricia think about all this? She's completely done with enabling it. She told Chloe that if she wanted sympathy, she could find it in the dictionary between stupid and syphilis. David laughed at the memory. Aunt Patricia doesn't mince words when she's fed up. And Marcus? How is he handling everything? David's expression grew more serious. From what I hear, not well. He's working double shifts trying to keep up with their expenses, and the stress is showing. Aunt Patricia saw him at the grocery store last week and said he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. The mother in me ached at the image of my son struggling, even though the rational part of my mind knew he'd created his own difficulties by choosing his wife's demands over his mother's dignity. I found myself wondering if he ever thought about the comfortable home he'd walked away from, the meals he didn't have to cook, the laundry he didn't have to do, the dozen small conveniences he'd taken for granted until they were gone. Do you think he regrets what happened? I asked. David considered this carefully before answering. I think he regrets the consequences, but I'm not sure he regrets the choices that led to them. There's a difference between being sorry about how things turned out and being sorry about what you did wrong. It was an astute observation from someone who barely knew the situation, but it felt accurate in a way that made my chest tighten. Marcus was probably sorry that his life had become more difficult, but that didn't mean he understood or acknowledged his role in making it that way. 3 weeks into David's tenancy, I was watering plants on the front porch when Marcus's truck pulled into the driveway for the first time since he'd moved out. My heart started beating faster, not from joy but from the kind of anxiety that comes with knowing an unpleasant conversation is about to unfold. He sat in the truck for several minutes before getting out, and when he did, I could see that David's assessment had been accurate. Marcus looked exhausted, thinner, and older than his 32 years should have allowed. He walked toward the porch with the hesitant gait of someone approaching a place where they weren't sure they'd be welcome. His clothes were clean but rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. "Hi, Mom," he said when he reached the bottom of the porch steps. His voice was uncertain, like he was testing the temperature of water before jumping in. "Hello, Marcus. You look tired." "I am tired. Working a lot of extra hours lately." He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "I was wondering if we could talk." I set down my watering. Kenan gestured toward the chairs where David and I often sat in the evenings. "Of course. Would you like some iced tea?" "That would be nice." When I returned with 2 glasses, Marcus was sitting rigidly in his chair, staring at the house like he was seeing it for the first time. I noticed him looking at the upstairs window of his old room, where David's truck was parked where Chloe's BMW used to sit. "You have a tenant," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been hurt or might have been simple observation. "I do. His name is David. And he's a wonderful addition to the household." "Patricia Marsh's nephew, right? Chloe's been going crazy about it." "Yes, David is Patricia's nephew." And I can imagine Chloe's reaction. Marcus took a long drink of his tea, buying time before whatever he'd come to say. She thinks you did it to hurt us. To prove some kind of point. What do you think? He was quiet for so long I wondered if he was going to answer at all. Finally, he said, I think you did what you needed to do. I think we pushed you into a corner and you found a way out. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than I'd expected. How are things going for you, Marcus? Really? Not great, if I'm being honest. The apartment was a nightmare, and living with Chloe's brother is challenging. 6 people in a 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. He rubbed his face with both hands in that familiar gesture. I've been thinking a lot about what happened here. About what I should have done differently. And what conclusions have you reached? That I was a coward. That I let Chloe treat you badly because it was easier than standing up to her. That I convinced myself her demands were reasonable because the alternative was admitting I'd married someone who could be cruel to my own mother. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched tight. Not forgiveness, exactly, but relief that my son was capable of seeing the truth even if it had taken losing everything to get there. Where is Chloe now? I asked. At work. She doesn't know I'm here, and she wouldn't approve if she did. Marcus looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of the boy who used to confess his mistakes with the hope that honesty would earn him understanding. She's still angry about everything. Still convinced that you were wrong and we were right. And what do you think? I think she's never going to admit she was wrong about anything, and I'm tired of pretending that's normal or acceptable. He set down his glass and leaned forward slightly. Mom, I came here to apologize. Not to ask for anything or to make excuses, just to say I'm sorry for what I did and what I didn't do. I appreciate that, Marcus. More than you know. I let her charge you rent to live in your own house. I let her treat you like a burden instead of like the woman who raised me and loved me unconditionally for 32 years. I chose keeping peace with my wife over protecting my mother, and there's no excuse for that. Tears were gathering in my eyes, but they weren't entirely sad tears. They were the complex emotions of a mother hearing her son finally understand something she'd been trying to teach him his entire life about right and wrong and the courage it takes to choose right even when it's difficult. What happens now? I asked. I don't know. Chloe and I have some serious problems that go way beyond housing situations. She wants me to ask you to let us move back in, to pretend nothing happened and go back to how things were. And what do you want? I want to be someone you can be proud of again. I want to be the kind of man Dad would have respected. I want to stop making decisions based on what's easiest and start making them based on what's right. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood awakening to another autumn afternoon. Mrs. Chen was working in her garden across the street, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking with the persistent enthusiasm that suggested a squirrel had invaded its territory. Marcus, I said finally, you'll always be my son, and I'll always love you. But love doesn't mean going back to a situation that was harmful to both of us. It doesn't mean pretending that what happened was acceptable or that it won't happen again. I understand. I wouldn't expect you to trust us again after what we did. It's not about trust, sweetheart. It's about boundaries. It's about me finally learning that I deserve to be treated with respect in my own home, and you finally learning that marriage doesn't mean abandoning your principles or your family obligations. Marcus nodded slowly, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was saying. So there's no going back. Not to how things were, no. But that doesn't mean there's no going forward to something better. What would that look like? I considered the question carefully, because I wanted to be honest about what I could offer and what I needed from him. It would look like you figuring out who you want to be as a person and as a husband. It would look like you making choices based on your values instead of on avoiding conflict. It would look like you treating me like your mother instead of like someone your wife gets to abuse when she's frustrated. And if I do those things? If I become the person I should have been all along? Then we rebuild our relationship from there. Slowly, carefully, with mutual respect and clear boundaries. But Marcus, you have to want to change for yourself. Not because you think it will get you something you want. A car pulled into the driveway behind Marcus's truck, and we both turned to see David's pickup returning from whatever errands had taken him out that afternoon. He parked and got out, lifting a hand in friendly greeting when he saw us on the porch. Velma, Marcus, he said as he approached the steps. Good to see you both. David, this is my son Marcus. Marcus, this is David, my tenant. The two men shook hands with the careful politeness of people who understood they were in a potentially awkward situation. David had the advantage of knowing the full story, while Marcus was clearly trying to figure out how to relate to the man who was living in his childhood bedroom. I hope you're comfortable here, Marcus said, and to his credit, he managed to sound genuine rather than resentful. Very comfortable, thank you. Your mother is an excellent landlord, and this is a beautiful house. You were lucky to grow up here. I was, Marcus agreed, looking around at the property with what might have been regret or might have been appreciation. I didn't always appreciate it as much as I should have. David nodded diplomatically and excused himself to go inside, leaving Marcus and me alone again with the weight of 32 years of history and the uncertainty of whatever future we might be able to build together. He seems like a good guy, Marcus said after David had gone inside. He is. He's respectful, responsible, and grateful for what he has. All the qualities I tried to teach you when you were growing up. Marcus winced slightly at the implication. But he didn't argue. I should probably go. Chloe will be home soon, and I don't want to explain where I've been. Marcus, at some point you're going to have to stop hiding things from your wife or hiding your wife's behavior from other people. A marriage built on keeping secrets and avoiding conversations isn't really a marriage. I know. I'm just not ready for that fight yet. Then you're not ready to change yet. And until you are, nothing else is going to get better. He stood up slowly, like an old man with aching joints, and looked down at me with something that might have been hope. Or might have been resignation. Thanks for letting me come by. Thanks for listening. You're always welcome to come by, Marcus. But next time, I hope it will be because you've made some decisions about what kind of person you want to be, not because you're running away from the decisions you need to make. I watched him drive away, noting how he sat in the truck for several minutes before starting the engine, like he was gathering courage for whatever conversation waited for him at Chloe's brother's house. Part of me wanted to call him back, to offer him money or advice or the unconditional support that mothers are supposed to provide. But I'd learned the hard way that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their choices without rushing in to rescue them. That evening, David and I sat on the front porch with glasses of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why Gerald and I had fallen in love with this house in the first place. David had worked a double shift the night before and was enjoying a rare evening off with the relaxed contentment of someone who appreciated simple pleasures. I hope my presence here didn't make that conversation with your son more difficult, he said after I'd given him a brief summary of Marcus's visit. Actually, I think it helped. It showed him that I've moved on, that I've found a way to make this house work for me without needing him or his wife to validate my choices. Do you think he'll make the changes he talked about? I considered the question while watching Mrs. Chen water her roses across the street. I don't know. Change is hard, especially when it means admitting you've been wrong about fundamental things. And it's even harder when the people around you aren't supporting that change. You mean his wife? I mean his wife. Chloe has too much invested in being right about everything to admit that she was wrong about this. And Marcus has spent 3 years learning to manage her moods instead of challenging her behavior. David nodded thoughtfully. It's hard to unlearn patterns like that, especially when changing them means risking the relationship. But sometimes risking the relationship is the only way to save it. And sometimes the relationship isn't worth saving if it requires you to compromise your integrity to maintain it. We sat in comfortable silence as the evening settled around us, two people who understood the value of peace and the price of conflict. The house felt solid and welcoming around us, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from knowing everyone inside its walls was there by choice and treated everyone else with mutual respect. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it to see Patricia's name on the screen. Chloe just called screaming about Marcus visiting you. Apparently he came home and told her he'd apologized. She's threatening to leave him if he maintains any contact with you. Thought you should know. I showed the message to David, who shook his head with the kind of resignation that comes from watching family drama unfold from a safe distance. Well, that didn't take long. No, it didn't. And now Marcus gets to choose whether he wants to be married to someone who demands that he cut off his mother or whether he wants to be the kind of man who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult. What do you think he'll choose? I thought about my son, about the boy who used to tell me everything and ask my advice about problems both big and small, about the man who'd sat on my porch that afternoon acknowledging his mistakes with what seemed like genuine remorse. I thought about the 3 years he'd spent learning to manage Chloe's demands instead of challenging them, about the patterns of behavior that had brought them to this point. I think he'll choose what he's always chosen, I said finally. The path of least resistance. At least for now. I'm sorry. Don't be. I've done everything I could to teach him right from wrong, to show him what healthy relationships look like, to model the kind of strength that comes from standing up for yourself and other people. If he chooses to ignore those lessons in favor of keeping peace with someone who treats people badly, that's his choice to make and his consequences to live with. David raised his wine glass in a small toast. To people who make good choices, even when they're hard ones. To people who understand that dignity isn't negotiable, I replied, clicking my glass against his. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with Marcus's number showing on the display. I answered it, curious about what had prompted him to call so soon after our afternoon conversation. Mom? His voice was tight with stress and exhaustion. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. If I left Chloe, if I filed for divorce and started over, would there be room in your life for me again? Not in your house, he added quickly. I understand that bridge is burned. But in your life? My heart started beating faster, not from anxiety this time but from hope. Marcus, there has never been a moment when there wasn't room in my life for you. The question is whether you're ready to be someone who deserves that room. I think I am. I think I'm finally ready to stop being afraid of her and start being the man you and Dad raised me to be. What happened? What changed? She gave me an ultimatum. Cut off all contact with you and never mention your name again, or she's leaving me. Marcus's laugh was bitter and tired. She actually said I had to choose between my wife and my mother, like those were equivalent choices. And what did you tell her? I told her that any woman who would ask a man to abandon his mother wasn't the kind of woman worth being married to. I told her that I was done letting her control who I could talk to and what I was allowed to feel guilty about. I closed my eyes and felt tears gathering, but they were tears of relief and pride rather than sadness. How did she respond to that? About like you'd expect. Screaming, threats, accusations that you'd poison me against her. She's packing her things right now and threatening to take everything we own in the divorce. Are you okay with that? Mom, we don't own anything worth fighting for. Everything we have is either broken, borrowed, or bought on credit we can't afford. She can take all of it and welcome to it. What will you do now? Figure out how to be a person I can respect again. Find a place I can afford on my own. Learn how to live within my means instead of expecting other people to subsidize my choices. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. And spend the rest of my life making up for the fact that I let someone treat my mother the way she treated you. Marcus, you don't have to make up for anything. You just have to move forward and make better choices. I want to, Mom. I want to be someone Dad would have been proud of, someone you can trust again. Then that's exactly who you'll become. It won't happen overnight, and it won't always be easy, but if you're committed to it, you'll get there. After I hung up the phone, David and I sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Quiet. Somewhere down the street, someone was grilling dinner, and the smell of charcoal and seasoned meat drifted through the air like a promise of normalcy and comfort. Sounds like your son made his choice, David said gently. It sounds like he did. Finally. How do you feel about it? I considered the question while watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Proud of him for finding his courage. Sad that it took him so long to find it. Hopeful that this is the beginning of him becoming the person he was meant to be all along. And relieved? And relieved, I admitted. Relieved that I won't have to keep choosing between protecting myself and loving my son. Relieved that he finally understands the difference between enabling bad behavior and supporting good choices. The porch light came on automatically, casting its warm glow over the chairs where I'd confronted my son's entitlement, met my tenant's appreciation, and finally heard my child acknowledge his mistakes with what sounded like genuine remorse and commitment to change. It had been a long journey from the morning when Chloe handed me that invoice demanding rent for living in my own house to this evening when Marcus called to tell me he'd chosen his mother over a woman who demanded he abandon her. There had been moments when I'd wondered if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too unwilling to enable behavior that might eventually improve if I just showed enough patience and unconditional love. But sitting on my front porch with a tenant who respected me and a son who was finally ready to earn back my respect, I knew I'd made the right choices. I'd learned that love without boundaries wasn't really love, it was enablement. I'd discovered that protecting myself from abuse wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I'd found that demanding respect didn't make me difficult, it made me someone worth respecting. The house around me felt solid and peaceful, filled with the contentment that comes from knowing everyone inside its walls was there by choice and mutual agreement. David was upstairs reading one of his medical journals, probably preparing for another night shift at the hospital where he helped people through their worst moments with competence and compassion. Marcus was somewhere across town beginning the difficult process of rebuilding his life on foundations of integrity instead of convenience. And I was exactly where I belonged, in the home Gerald and I had built together, surrounded by the garden we'd planted and the memories we'd created. Finally free to be myself without apology or compromise. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I thought about growing old with grandchildren visiting and family holidays that brought everyone together under my roof. But it was a life I'd chosen deliberately, with intention and self-respect, and that felt like the kind of victory worth celebrating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.